You know that feeling when someone younger asks you to explain something you grew up with? Maybe how you used to find someone's house without GPS, or how you made plans without being able to text. And halfway through your explanation, you realize you're not just describing a different technology, you're describing a different way of existing in the world. And they're nodding politely, but you can see it in their eyes. They think you're talking about inconvenience. They don't understand that you're talking about a completely different relationship with uncertainty, with boredom, with being alone inside your own head for hours at a time without even a phone, let alone a phone with internet access. If you grew up in the 1970s, you've probably had this conversation more than once, and you've probably walked away from it feeling like something important got lost in translation. Here's what's interesting. We tend to think of generational differences as being about technology, music, or politics. But what if the real difference is something deeper? What if growing up in the 70s didn't just give you a different childhood? What if it actually wired your brain to process reality itself in a fundamentally different way? Let me show you what I mean. There's something about people who grew up in the 70s. The broad strokes version goes something like this. They are skeptical of authority, fiercely independent, a little emotionally closed off, uncomfortable with today's oversharing culture, suspicious of anything that feels too polished or managed. They value authenticity but struggle to articulate their feelings. They're self-reliant to a fault. And like most beliefs, it's not entirely wrong, but it's also not the full picture, because what we call skepticism might actually be pattern recognition. What we call emotional distance might be a sophisticated form of self-protection, and what we call independence might be something more interesting, the psychological residue of growing up in a world that required you to develop an inner compass because there was no external one constantly available. Let me explain. In developmental psychology, there's a concept called locus of control. It refers to where you believe control over your life primarily resides. An internal locus means you believe your actions and decisions shape your outcomes. An external locus means you believe outside forces, luck, other people, and systems determine what happens to you. Now, everyone falls somewhere on the spectrum, but research from the late 80s and early 90s, when psychologists started examining generational patterns in personality development, found something worth paying attention to. People who grew up in the 70s, Generation X broadly speaking, showed markedly higher internal locus of control scores than the generations that came before them or after them. Why does this matter? Because locus of control isn't just about optimism or pessimism. It's about how you move through the world when things go wrong. It's about whether you instinctively look inward for solutions or outward for support. And neither approach is inherently better, but they produce very different people. If you grew up in the 70s, you grew up in a specific historical moment. Your parents were likely boomers, shaped by post-war optimism and institutional trust. But you came of age during Watergate, the oil crisis, rising divorce rates, and latchkey childhoods. You watched institutions fail. You watched adults lie. You watched the social contract your parents believed in start to fray at the edges. And you were often alone with that knowledge. Literally alone. Here's where it gets psychologically interesting. The human brain develops its core emotional and cognitive frameworks during childhood and adolescence. And one of the most important frameworks it develops is how to regulate anxiety in the absence of immediate reassurance. If you're a child in 2025 and you feel uncertain or afraid, you have almost infinite access to connection. You can text a friend, you can scroll through content that distracts you, you can join an online community of people who feel the same way. The feedback loop between discomfort and relief is nearly instantaneous. But if you grew up in 1975 and you felt uncertain or afraid, you had to sit with it. You had to develop what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to experience uncomfortable emotions without immediately trying to eliminate them. Not because you were tougher or better, but because there was no mechanism to make the discomfort go away quickly. You learned to entertain yourself for hours. You learned to problem solve without asking for help because help wasn't always readily available. You learned to read subtle social cues in face-to-face interactions because that's all you had. You learned to be comfortable with silence, with waiting, with not knowing, and your brain encoded all of this as normal.
There's a researcher named Sherry Turkle at MIT who studies the psychology of technology and connection. She's not specifically focused on the 70s generation, but her work on what she calls the flight from conversation is illuminating here.
She describes how constant connectivity has changed our relationship with solitude. We've started to experience being alone as a problem to be solved, rather than a state to be inhabited. And when we can't tolerate loneliness, we also can't access the kind of deep self-reflection that being alone makes possible. But if you grew up in the 70s, being alone wasn't optional. It was just the default state of existence for large portions of your day. After school, you came home to an empty house. On weekends, you disappeared into the neighborhood for hours. During summer, entire days could pass where you spoke to almost no one. And in that absence of anybody, something happened. You developed an internal world. You had long, complex conversations with yourself. You built elaborate mental models of how things worked. You became your own primary source of entertainment, problem solving, and emotional regulation. This isn't romanticizing the past. Plenty of children in the 70s felt neglected, lonely, or unsupported. But it's also not dismissing a real psychological difference, because that enforced self-reliance created a particular kind of cognitive architecture. You learned to trust your own judgment because you had to, and decades later, that shows up as something other people sometimes misinterpret. Take a moment here. Think about how you respond when someone offers you unsolicited advice, or when someone suggests you should talk to a therapist or join a support group, or when the prevailing cultural message is that you should be more open, more vulnerable, more willing to share your struggles publicly. What's your first internal reaction? If you're being honest, it might be something like resistance. Not because you think you're perfect or don't need help, but because there's something in you that recoils at the idea of outsourcing your internal experience. Something that says quietly but firmly, I can handle this myself. Now, where does that come from? For some people, that impulse is unhealthy. It's avoidance masquerading as strength. It's someone refusing connection because they're afraid of vulnerability, and that fear is making them smaller, more isolated, less fully human. But for others, and this is the distinction that matters, it's not avoidance at all. It's an honest assessment. It's someone who knows themselves well enough to know they process things better internally first, who finds clarity in being alone and clutter in constant input, who understands that not every problem is solved by talking it through with someone else. The difference between these two is self-awareness. One is running from discomfort, the other is running toward understanding. And if you grew up in the 70s, you were trained, almost accidentally, to develop that kind of self-awareness, because you had to, because there was no app to tell you how you were feeling or an algorithm to suggest what you should do next. You had to figure it out yourself. There's a concept in philosophy called negative capability. The poet John Keats coined it in 1817, describing the capacity to exist in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, the ability to sit with not knowing and still function. This is not a skill our current culture particularly values. We're encouraged to have opinions immediately, to optimize everything, to seek closure and certainty and measurable outcomes. Ambiguity is treated as something to be resolved as quickly as possible. But people who grew up in the 70s had ambiguity baked into their daily experience. You didn't know if your friend was home until you rode your bike over to their house and knocked on the door. You didn't know if the movie you wanted to see was sold out until you arrived at the theater. You didn't know what happened in the world until the evening news came on, and even then, you only got a curated 30-minute summary. Life was full of unanswered questions that you just carried with you, and you learned to be okay with that. This produced a particular psychological orientation, a comfort with incompleteness, a willingness to make decisions with imperfect information, a tendency to trust the process rather than demand the outcome up front.
In organizational psychology, they call this tolerance for ambiguity, and it's considered a key trait of effective leadership and creative problem solving. But in everyday life, it often just looks like someone who doesn't get as anxious as everyone else when things are uncertain. Now, here's where we need to be careful. None of this means growing up in the 70s was better or produced superior people. That's not the point. Every generation develops adaptive strategies for the world they inherit, and every generation's strategies come with trade-offs. The same internal locus of control that makes you self-reliant can also make you stubborn. The same comfort with solitude that gives you a rich internal life can also make you distant in relationships. The same skepticism of institutions that protects you from manipulation can also make you cynical and closed to positive change. And there's a shadow side here that's worth acknowledging. Some people who grew up in the 70s learned self-reliance because they were genuinely neglected. Some developed distress tolerance because no one was paying attention to their distress. Some became emotionally self-contained because emotional expression was actively punished in their households. Survival skills aren't the same as thriving skills, and what helped you survive a lonely childhood doesn't automatically serve you in adult relationships, where vulnerability and interdependence are actually the healthier path. So the question isn't whether the 70s childhood was good or bad. The question is, can you recognize which parts of how you operate are genuine strengths and which parts are outdated defense mechanisms you're still running because you haven't examined them? Because here's the deeper truth. Every generation gets shaped by forces outside their control and then spends the rest of their lives either unconsciously repeating those patterns or consciously choosing something different. The people who grew up in the 70s are no exception. What makes you interesting isn't that you can survive without constant connection or external validation. What makes you interesting is that you know what that survival cost is, and you have a choice now about whether to keep paying it. You can be self-reliant and also ask for help. You can trust your own judgment and also stay open to new information. You can value authenticity and also recognize that sometimes the most authentic thing you can do is admit you don't have it all figured out. The internal compass you developed as a kid, that's real, that's valuable. But a compass only works if you occasionally check it against external landmarks to make sure you're not drifting. There's something poignant about watching people who grew up in the 70s navigate the modern world. Because in many ways, the skills you developed, self-sufficiency, critical thinking, comfort with boredom, distrust of performative nonsense, those are exactly the skills people today are desperately trying to relearn. There are entire movements now dedicated to digital minimalism, to reclaiming attention, to building distress tolerance, to finding meaning in being alone. Things you figured out by necessity at age 9. But there's a difference between having those skills and weaponizing them, between being self-reliant and being isolated, between being skeptical and being closed. The version of you that learned to be okay alone in an empty house after school, that version of you was adapting brilliantly to the circumstances you were given. But you're not in that house anymore, and the people in your life now aren't the ones who left you there. So maybe the real psychological insight here isn't about what growing up in the 70s did to you. Maybe it's about what you do with that legacy now. Because the world has changed, and you can either hold on to the adaptation strategies of your childhood as proof of your superiority, or you can recognize them as one set of tools among many. Valuable tools, yes, but not the only ones. You know how to be alone with your thoughts. That's rare and precious. But do you also know how to be truly present with someone else's? You know how to trust your own judgment. That's powerful. But do you also know how to update that judgment when new evidence arrives? You know how to endure discomfort without immediately reaching for relief. That's wisdom. But do you also know when reaching for connection is actually the braver choice? Here's what I think is true. Growing up in the 70s gave you a particular kind of emotional and cognitive infrastructure. It made you good at certain things and blind to others, as every formative experience does. And the older you get, the more you realize that the question isn't whether your childhood was better or worse than someone else's.
The question is whether you're still living as if you're in that childhood, or whether you've integrated its lessons into a more complete version of yourself. There's nothing wrong with valuing self-reliance, but there's also nothing wrong with acknowledging that humans are fundamentally social creatures, and that some of the deepest meaning in life comes from the moments when we let someone else in. There's nothing wrong with being skeptical of institutions and collective narratives, but there's also nothing wrong with occasionally choosing to trust something bigger than yourself. There's nothing wrong with having a rich internal world, but there's also nothing wrong with sharing it. You survived something real, a particular kind of disconnection that shaped you in ways that are still coming to memory decades later, and you don't have to defend that or apologize for it, but you also don't have to be ruled by it. The thing about growing up in the 70s is that it taught you to find your own way in the dark, and that's a skill that never stops being useful. But maybe the next frontier isn't about proving you can do everything alone. Maybe it's about recognizing that you don't have to anymore. If this resonated with you, the next video explores what happens when self-reliance crosses over into emotional isolation without you noticing, and how to tell the difference. And after that, we'll look at why people who value authenticity often struggle in relationships, and what that reveals about how we've confused honesty with intimacy. These aren't random topics. They're the natural questions that emerge once you start examining the stories you've been telling yourself about who you are and why. I'll see you there.